The weathered wooden cross still stands against the Montana sky, though the church beneath it collapsed 3 winters ago. Old-timer Jake Morrison remembers when 30 families filled those pews every Sunday morning, their voices rising in harmony across the prairie. Now the closest neighbor lives 14 miles away, and the only congregation left is a family of barn owls that nested in what used to be the bell tower. This isn't just one story. It's happening in thousands of places across rural America, where faith once anchored entire communities. Churches that survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless harsh winters are now surrendering to something they never expected: emptiness. In Grafton, Nebraska, population 42, the Methodist Church held its final service on a blustery March morning in 2019. Reverend Patricia Wells, who had driven 50 miles every Sunday for the past 6 years to preach to an average of 8 congregants, delivered her farewell sermon to 4 people. 3 of them were over 75. The fourth was the woman who cleaned the church, and she was there to lock the doors one last time. But Patricia didn't cry that day. She'd been preparing for this moment for years, watching as death claimed the faithful faster than birth could replace them. What broke her heart wasn't the ending, it was remembering how it used to be. Her predecessor, Reverend Thomas Hartley, had told her stories about Christmas Eve services so crowded that people stood outside in the snow, listening through open windows while children performed the nativity play inside. The numbers tell a stark story, but they don't capture the human drama behind them. Since 1990, over 6,000 rural churches have closed their doors permanently. That's roughly 2 churches every week for 3 decades. Counties that once boasted a dozen different denominations now struggle to keep a single sanctuary open. Church bells that once marked the rhythm of community life have fallen silent, and the buildings they called from sit empty, watching the countryside empty too. Take Millfield Township in Ohio, where the Bethel Baptist Church served as the unofficial town hall for over a century. Every major community decision was debated in its basement social hall. Wedding receptions, funeral luncheons, and town meetings all happened under the same roof where 3 generations of the Kowalski family were baptized. When the church closed in 2016, the township lost more than a place of worship. It lost its beating heart. The Kowalski family story illustrates the deeper forces at work here. Stanley Kowalski's grandfather built the church with his own hands in 1923, hauling stones from his farmland to construct the foundation. Stanley's father served as deacon for 47 years, and Stanley himself taught Sunday school for 3 decades. But Stanley's children moved to Columbus for work, and his grandchildren grew up thinking of Millfield as the place they visited twice a year, not home. This pattern repeats across the rural American landscape like a melancholy refrain. Young people leave for education and opportunity in cities. The remaining population ages and dwindles. Churches lose members to death faster than they gain them through conversion or birth. Pastoral salaries become impossible to maintain. Buildings deteriorate faster than volunteer labor can repair them. And one day, someone has to make the decision that no one wants to make. Hello there, fellow history enthusiasts. Welcome back to Professor Archive, where we explore the forgotten stories that shaped our world. I'm curious, where are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are? Are you in one of these small towns I'm talking about, or are you watching from a bustling city? And here's another question that might surprise you. What's your profession? I ask because this story touches every aspect of American life, whether you're a teacher in a suburb, a farmer in Iowa, or a banker in Manhattan. The phenomenon we're witnessing isn't just about religion declining. It's about the fundamental transformation of how Americans live and connect with each other. These churches weren't just spiritual centers, they were social infrastructure. They organized volunteer fire departments, sponsored Little League teams, and provided assistance to neighbors in crisis. The Methodist Church in tiny Riverside, Iowa, didn't just offer salvation on Sundays. It served as the community's disaster relief center during floods, its fellowship hall becoming a temporary shelter where denominational differences meant nothing. Consider the story of the Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Panna Maria, Texas, the oldest Polish parish in America. Founded in 1854 by immigrants who walked nearly 200 miles from Galveston, carrying a wooden statue of the Virgin Mary, this church survived Indian raids, droughts, and the chaos of Reconstruction. The Polish community maintained their traditions here for over a century and a half, conducting masses in Polish long after the language faded from daily use. But by 2018, the parish could no longer support a full-time priest. Father Miguel Zavala, who spoke neither Polish nor English particularly well when he arrived from Mexico, found himself shepherding the final chapter of this remarkable community. The irony wasn't lost on him. A Mexican priest delivering the last rites to a Polish-American congregation in the heart of Texas. America contained in a single moment. The economic realities behind these closures reveal the brutal mathematics of rural decline. A typical rural church needs about 50 active families to remain financially viable. That accounts for pastoral salaries, building maintenance, utilities, and basic programming. But rural counties have lost an average of 20% of their population since 1980. Do the math, and you'll see why so many congregations find themselves caught in an impossible bind. Reverend Sarah Chen discovered this firsthand when she accepted a position serving 3 Lutheran parishes across central Nebraska. Her weekly schedule reads like a logistical nightmare. Sunday morning service in Millerville, Sunday afternoon in Hartwell, evening service in Sage Creek. That's 180 miles of driving every Sunday, not counting the hospital visits, funeral services, and counseling sessions scattered throughout the week. Sarah, a second-generation Chinese-American whose parents ran a restaurant in San Francisco, never imagined she'd build her ministry among cornfields and cattle ranches. But she fell in love with the stubborn faith of her rural congregations. These people don't come to church when it's convenient, she says. They come during blizzards and harvest season and personal heartbreak alike. Their faith isn't a lifestyle choice, it's the foundation everything else is built on. The diversity of Sarah's own background points to another crucial aspect of this story. Rural America's churches are increasingly served by pastors from unexpected places. Korean Methodist ministers serve predominantly white congregations in Kansas. Mexican Catholic priests tend to Polish parishes in Wisconsin. Theological seminary graduates from Uganda and Nigeria accept calls to Reformed churches in Montana that their American-born classmates decline. This international dimension adds complexity to a story often told in purely local terms. The rural American church crisis coincides with explosive growth in global Christianity, particularly in Africa and Asia. While Methodist churches close in small Iowa towns, Methodist congregations boom in Ghana and South Korea. The faith isn't dying, it's moving. But global context provides little comfort to Geraldine Murphy, who walks past the boarded-up windows of St. Bridget's Catholic Church every morning on her way to collect the mail in Shanahan, Iowa. Geraldine, now 83, was married in that church 61 years ago. Her 4 children were baptized there. She buried her husband Tom from that altar 3 years ago. When the Diocese of Dubuque announced that St. Bridget's would close due to declining attendance and the priest shortage, Geraldine organized a letter-writing campaign that reached the Vatican itself. The Vatican never replied. The church closed on the Feast of St. Bridget February 1st, 2020, a date Geraldine notes with bitter irony. The saint who supposedly protected Ireland couldn't protect her own parish in Iowa. The final Mass drew 47 people, including relatives who drove from 4 states to witness the end of an era. Geraldine's story highlights the deep personal grief woven through this broader narrative. These aren't just buildings being lost, they're repositories of memory, identity, and meaning. Every rural church closure represents hundreds of personal losses multiplied across generations. Wedding photos that no longer match reality. Burial plots in cemeteries that will soon lack caretakers. Confirmation certificates from institutions that no longer exist. The practical consequences extend far beyond sentiment. Rural churches often served as civic infrastructure in ways that urban Americans rarely consider. The Township Hall in Pleasanton, Kansas, hasn't held a public meeting in 7 years. Everyone just gathered after Wednesday night services at the Presbyterian Church. When that church closed, the township lost its de facto government seat. Town decisions now get made through a chain of phone calls and kitchen table conversations that exclude anyone not already in the inner circle. Healthcare connections provide another example. Rural churches traditionally maintained informal networks that helped identify elderly parishioners in crisis. Mrs. Anderson missing 2 Sunday services in a row meant someone would check on her by Tuesday. These organic safety nets developed over decades of shared community life. When the churches disappear, no government program or social service agency replaces that function. The story of children especially underscores what's being lost. In its heyday, the Riverside Baptist Church in Broken Bow, Oklahoma, ran a vacation Bible school that drew 60 kids every summer. Children from every family in the area attended, regardless of denomination, because it was simply what you did with your kids in July. The church provided arts and crafts, outdoor games, Bible stories, and enough sugar-fueled chaos to tire out farm children accustomed to wide-open spaces. When Riverside Baptist held its final vacation Bible school in 2017, 5 children attended. The teenagers who once served as camp counselors had graduated and left for college in Norman or Oklahoma City. The elementary school that used to provide a steady stream of participants had consolidated with the district seat 23 miles away. The young families that remained in the area found themselves stretched too thin between farm work and longer commutes to establish the kinds of traditions their own parents had taken for granted. But perhaps the most profound loss involves storytelling and memory preservation. Rural churches served as unofficial historical societies, maintaining records and narratives that connected present residents to their community's past. The basement archives of the First Christian Church in Dawson, Minnesota, contained handwritten chronicles dating to 1891, documenting everything from grasshopper plagues to barn-raising celebrations to the influenza pandemic of 1918. When the congregation could no longer maintain the building, they faced an agonizing decision about those records. The Regional Historical Society lacked space and staff to properly care for them. Family descendants had scattered across the country. Eventually, 3 members split up the collection, taking boxes home to spare bedrooms and garage shelves where they remain, slowly deteriorating and gradually forgotten. This pattern of lost history repeats itself in communities across rural America. Church records often represent the most complete documentation of local life, especially in places too small to maintain formal museums or archives. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, and death records tell legal stories, but church minutes and pastoral notes capture the human dimension. Who helped whom during hard times? How the community celebrated milestones? What external events shaped local experience? The architectural heritage being lost deserves attention too. Rural churches represent some of the finest craftsmanship in their communities, built by generations who invested their best materials and skills in structures meant to last forever. The white steepled churches that populate American postcards required enormous community effort to construct and maintain. Every board, nail, and pane of glass represented shared sacrifice and common vision. The Gothic Revival Methodist Church in Harmony, Pennsylvania, took 12 years to complete, from 1878 to 1890. Community members quarried limestone from their own land, milled lumber from their own forests, and contributed labor during winter months when farm demands lightened. The stained glass windows were imported from Germany, paid for by a fundraising campaign that lasted 6 years and involved everything from church suppers to barn dance auctions. When the Harmony Methodist congregation merged with a neighboring parish in 2019, they faced the question that haunts every closing church. What happens to the building? Selling it seemed like betrayal. Maintaining it without a congregation proved impossible. Demolition felt like sacrilege. 3 years later, the building still sits empty while the community searches for solutions that satisfy legal requirements, financial realities, and emotional needs. Some communities have found creative alternatives. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in Lindsborg, Kansas, transformed itself into a community center that hosts everything from town council meetings to wedding receptions to amateur theater productions. The sanctuary maintains its religious character for the handful of families who still want traditional services, but the building serves broader community needs throughout the week. Other congregations have embraced shared ministry models that allow buildings to remain active with reduced overhead. 5 Presbyterian churches across 3 counties in North Dakota pool resources to employ one pastor and alternate hosting weekly services. Each congregation maintains its building and distinct identity while acknowledging that none could survive independently. The most dramatic solution involves physical relocation. When the Zion Lutheran Church in Emmerich, Minnesota faced closure due to population decline, the congregation decided to move their 1897 building to the county seat 18 miles away. The process involved lifting the entire structure onto a massive trailer and transporting it down country highways at 3 miles per hour while power companies lifted electrical lines. The move took 11 hours and drew crowds of spectators who lined the route like mourners at a funeral procession. But the arriving congregation found new life in their relocated sanctuary, joining with urban church members who appreciated the small-town intimacy that their building represented. Technology offers some interesting possibilities for preserving rural church communities, even after physical buildings close. The Chapel Hill Baptist Church in remote eastern Montana streams services live on Facebook, allowing former members who moved away to participate virtually in familiar worship. Christmas Eve services now include faces beaming in from Seattle, Minneapolis, and Dallas. Children and grandchildren who grew up in the church but left for opportunities elsewhere. Virtual participation can't replicate the full experience of physical community, but it maintains connections that pure geographical distance would otherwise sever. Former members contribute financially to building maintenance and pastoral salaries, seeing themselves as distant congregants rather than nostalgic alumni. The theological implications of rural church decline deserve consideration too. Different Christian traditions approach community and place in varying ways, and these differences influence how they respond to demographic pressure. Catholic parishes, with their emphasis on geographical boundaries and sacramental authority, face different challenges than Baptist congregations that can more easily merge or relocate. Episcopal churches, already struggling with broader denominational conflicts, find rural parishes caught between diminishing local membership and uncertain institutional support. Presbyterian and Methodist churches benefit from formal support structures that help small congregations share resources and plan transitions. But all Christian denominations must grapple with fundamental questions about the relationship between faith and place. Does a church exist primarily to serve people who happen to live nearby? Or does it embody something essential about particular communities and landscapes that gives it purpose beyond membership numbers? The Reverend Dr. Michael Thompson, who pastors the Union Congregational Church in rural Vermont, argues for a third approach he calls ministry of presence. Even when traditional congregational activities become impossible to sustain, the church maintains its witness by simply remaining present in the community. Services might happen monthly instead of weekly. Programming might reduce to essentials. But the doors stay open, the building remains cared for, and the church continues to offer itself as a resource for times of crisis or celebration. This presence-focused ministry requires financial support from outside sources, denominational bodies, urban partner churches, or individual donors who value rural church preservation. It acknowledges that traditional metrics of congregational success don't apply in areas experiencing population decline, but insists that church witness transcends numerical measures. Critics question whether empty or nearly empty churches serve any meaningful purpose, arguing that scarce resources should focus on areas where churches can actually grow and thrive. They point out that maintaining elaborate buildings for tiny congregations represents poor stewardship of both money and volunteer energy. But defenders of rural church preservation argue that these institutions provide irreplaceable community functions that justify support beyond their religious role. Emergency shelters during natural disasters, polling places during elections, neutral gathering spaces for community discussions, and symbols of continuity during times of rapid change all represent public goods that benefit entire communities, regardless of individual faith commitments. The economic development potential of historic churches also deserves mention. Rural communities increasingly recognize that well-maintained historic buildings can attract tourism, arts programming, and cultural events that bring outside dollars into struggling local economies. The old German Lutheran Church in Fredericksburg, Texas, draws thousands of visitors annually who come to appreciate its distinctive architecture and learn about German immigrant history. Wedding tourism represents a particularly promising niche. Couples from urban areas often seek distinctive photogenic venues for destination weddings, and rural churches offer authentic charm that purpose-built event spaces struggle to match. The Stone Presbyterian Church in Dubuque County, Iowa, books more wedding ceremonies now than it ever held during its active congregational life, generating rental income that funds building maintenance and modest community programming. But commercializing sacred spaces creates its own tensions. Longtime community members sometimes feel conflicted about seeing their church reduced to a pretty backdrop for strangers' celebrations. Former parishioners may prefer that buildings remain purely religious in character, even if that means eventual abandonment. Cultural preservation efforts face similar ambiguities. Museums and historical societies value rural churches as examples of vernacular architecture and community development patterns. But preserving buildings as historical artifacts fundamentally changes their meaning and purpose in ways that some communities find unsettling. The Southwick Congregational Church in Massachusetts illustrates these complexities. Built in 1822, the building represents an outstanding example of federal period religious architecture. When the congregation disbanded in 2018, the town voted to purchase the building and maintain it as a municipal historic site. The preservation plan maintains the sanctuary exactly as it appeared during its final service, complete with hymnals in the pews and flowers on the altar. Guided tours draw architecture enthusiasts and local history buffs. But community members express unease about treating their former place of worship like a museum exhibit, frozen in time and stripped of spiritual purpose. Photography projects have emerged to document disappearing rural churches before they're lost entirely. Professional photographers like Matt Ike and amateur enthusiasts collaborate to create visual records of buildings, communities, and individuals affected by rural church decline. These photographic archives serve multiple purposes. They preserve images of architectural details and community gatherings for future historians. They help current community members process grief and change by creating permanent records of what they're losing. And they raise public awareness about rural church decline among viewers who might never have considered the issue. But photography also raises ethical questions about representation and exploitation. When urban photographers arrive to document authentic rural America, they inevitably bring their own assumptions and agendas. Community members may feel reduced to exotic subjects rather than complex people navigating difficult circumstances. The most sensitive photography projects involve collaboration between outside artists and local residents, ensuring that community members maintain some control over how their stories get told. These partnerships can produce powerful documentation while avoiding the extractive dynamics that have characterized much outsider coverage of rural America. International comparisons provide useful perspective on American rural church decline. Similar patterns affect religious institutions across the developed world as urbanization, secularization, and demographic change transform traditional communities. Rural churches in Germany, Sweden, and other European countries have pioneered adaptive strategies that American communities might consider. Shared use agreements allow Muslim or Hindu immigrants to use Christian buildings for worship, maintaining sacred purpose while acknowledging religious diversity. Community land trusts preserve church buildings for public benefit after religious congregations disband. Some European models emphasize the cultural rather than specifically religious significance of churches, treating them as community heritage sites that deserve preservation regardless of current faith commitments. This approach requires public funding and broad community buy-in, but it has successfully maintained hundreds of rural churches that would otherwise have been demolished. Canadian rural churches face challenges very similar to their American counterparts, but different governmental structures and funding mechanisms allow for solutions that wouldn't work in the United States. Provincial heritage programs provide substantial support for church building preservation, and national healthcare systems reduce the social service burdens that American churches often carry. The future of rural American churches likely involves continued consolidation, creative adaptation, and partial loss. Demographics and economics make it impossible to maintain every building and congregation that existed during peak periods of rural population. But total abandonment isn't inevitable either. Some rural churches will survive by embracing new technologies, shared ministry models, and broader community partnerships. Others will find purpose as community centers, event venues, or heritage sites. Many will be lost entirely, joining the thousands of schools, post offices, and Main Street businesses that once anchored small town life. The human stories behind these changes deserve to be heard, honored, and remembered. Every church closure represents the end of countless personal narratives, family traditions, and community connections. But it also reflects the broader American story of mobility, opportunity, and adaptation that has always characterized our national experience. The farm families who built those churches in the 1800s were often themselves immigrants or migrants, leaving familiar places and traditions to pursue new opportunities in unfamiliar landscapes. Their descendants face similar choices today, weighing attachment to place against practical necessities of earning livelihoods and raising families. Perhaps the deepest lesson of rural church decline involves accepting change while preserving what's most essential about the communities and values these institutions represented. Faith, service, mutual aid, and shared responsibility for local welfare don't require specific buildings or traditional forms of organization to survive. The Grafton Methodist Church may have closed, but Patricia Wells now leads an informal Bible study group that meets in members' homes. The Sacred Heart Parish in Texas may lack a resident priest, but community members maintain the cemetery, organize annual heritage festivals, and ensure that elderly neighbors receive help with shopping and medical appointments. Buildings disappear, but communities persist in new forms adapted to contemporary realities. The challenge involves maintaining continuity of purpose and values while accepting transformation of structures and traditions. Rural America's churches embodied particular approaches to faith, community, and place that deserve respect and attention, even as demographic forces render them unsustainable in traditional forms. Their stories remind us that meaningful community life requires intentional effort, shared sacrifice, and long-term commitment that transcends individual convenience or preference. These lessons won't save every endangered church, but they might inform new approaches to community building that preserve what's most valuable about small-town social life. Rural church decline represents both ending and beginning, the conclusion of one chapter in American religious and community history, and the opportunity to write new chapters that honor the past while embracing the future. The wooden cross in Montana still stands against the endless sky, weathered but unbroken. Jake Morrison still drives past it every morning, remembering voices raised in harmony across the prairie. The building may have fallen, but something endures. Call it faith, call it memory, call it hope, that resists the forces of time and change. That's the story of rural America's forgotten churches. Not just decline and loss, but persistence and adaptation. Not just endings, but transformations that carry forward the essential human needs for connection, meaning, and shared purpose that brought communities together under those steeples in the first place. The bells may have fallen silent, but their echoes linger in the hearts of those who remember, and in the new forms of community that emerge from the ashes of the old. The forgotten churches of rural America are being remembered through every act of neighborliness, every informal gathering, every shared meal that continues the work of building beloved community in whatever form the future makes possible. Thank you so much for joining me today on this journey through America's vanishing rural churches. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear about your own connections to small-town churches. Whether you grew up in one, visited one, or simply appreciate the role they played in American community life. And don't forget to subscribe to Professor Archive for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of American history. Until next time, keep exploring the stories that shaped our world.